Hey, in this video, we're gonna go through and understand the difference between React server-side and client-side components. Server-side and client-side are two different environments where a component can render. So let's start with the client-side. Client-side is that it renders on the client's side. So aka for most people on the browser, whether it's a website or their phone, they're gonna get it rendered on the browser. You're gonna send some HTML, you're gonna send some JavaScript, and then you're gonna let the browser figure out how to do everything and fetch the data that needs to be on the site and everything. It turns the response from the server into a interface that's interactive. And it's what React's been running all this time, client-side components. They allow for interactivity on the site. You need to fetch the data in the browser. In Next.js 13, if you want to use a client-side component, you have to specifically mark it with the use client text on the top. This must be defined at the top of the file. If you've used a client component before, you might have seen a flash of data or a loading bar or something, just an empty field, and then the data appears. That's because the data needs to be fetched after the page is being fetched. That means that the initial HTML is pre-rendered on the server, given to the client, and then on the client side, it gets hydrated. So if you've ever experienced an async error using a client-side component, that the client-side component can't be async, that's because it's given to the browser and the browser can't async it. It just has to happen. So if you want to use async in your component, you're gonna have to use a server-side component. If you want to use fetch data in an async way on the server, you could use, for example, useEffect, where once things are being rendered, you can then call a function that is an async function that then fetches the user's data. But if you want to show data immediately to the client, well, then you have server-side components. Just to get clear, the server we refer to as the server or the computer where we store your app code in the cloud. So the client, browser or computer, sends the request to a server, which then fetches the component. And this is how we fetch a client-side component already, so that's nothing new. But the new part is that on the server, we can hydrate and actually render the HTML and send it back to the client. And this allows us to actually just send the HTML to the client and no JavaScript. And this is why you can use async and await components on the server side, because on the server, you can actually afford to wait for a request and then send it back to the client already filled out. Because they're already waiting for a short delay, they can wait a little longer for it to render on the server to then get it to you. So essentially what it does is, instead of you as a client requesting a component and then getting the component and then needing to fetch external data, the server can now pre-fetch that data for you and just give it to you. So it's one less round trip and it saves you a lot of time. As a client, it looks smoother, is more performant, and you get it quicker. So server-side components are brilliant for a lot of different reasons. For example, server-side components are brilliant for non-interactive elements, such as you have the navbar. It's always pretty much the same. You might just have a little section of that navbar, like a search bar on the navbar. That could be a client component, because that's interactivity. But everywhere you don't have interactivity, that's where you want to use a server-side component. Then wherever we need to have interactivity, we sprinkle in client-side components, like a search bar or a button. So what's the benefit of using server-side components? Why should we use them? You move the data fetching closer to the database. So instead of going from the client to the database, you can go from the server to the database. And you also keep large dependencies away from the client. This leads to improved performance because you don't need to send as much data to the client. You don't need to send the JavaScript and everything. You just send them what they need. When should you use server and client-side components? These are the times you should use a server component. When you need to fetch data, fetch it on the server side. When you need to access backend resources directly, do it on the server component. When you need to keep sensitive information on the server, do it on the server component, because you don't need to send access keys and so on to the front end. Nobody will be able to hack you because it's all locked away on the back end. So you're not exposing access keys or API keys. And also when you need to keep large dependencies on the server, use server components. You don't need to send a bunch of JavaScript bloating the client's performance. You can just keep it on your side, send it out, and you can already pre-cache it, so you just send the same response. If you've done the calculation, why should the client do the calculation? If you have a lot of users, why should they all do the same calculation when you can just do the calculation once on your server, and then everybody else can just benefit from that? That's a great benefit for the environment, using less resources. Then for the client component, when should you use client components? When you want interactivity, when you have on-click listeners, on-chain listeners, that's when you want to use client components. When you have state or lifecycle effects like use state, use effect, use reducer, that's when you use it on the client component. Or for example, when you need to use browser-only APIs, that's when you want to use a client component. Or maybe you have custom hooks that need to use the browser API or something, then you also need to send that on the client side. Or if you're using React class components, then you also need to do it on the client side. That's it.